The signal went out 4 minutes before the colony died, and nobody on the attacking fleet thought it mattered. High Overseer Vren Talis of the Sindrith Ascendancy watched the transmission spike on his tactical display and dismissed it with a flick of 2 fingers. A distress call. Predictable. Every dying settlement in the galaxy screamed the same way in its final moments, whether it belonged to a hive mind or a solitary predator species or, in this case, the newest and most tediously self-important arrivals to interstellar civilization, humans. "Where is it routed?" he asked, more out of procedure than curiosity. His signals officer, a narrow-faced Ithic named Soarar, studied the readout for a moment longer than the question deserved. "Unregistered relay. No flag, no fleet designation. It isn't going to their homeworld, Overseer. It's going somewhere in the perimeter dark. Junk space." Vren had no time for junk space. "Then it goes nowhere. Continue the bombardment." 200 kilometers below his flagship, the human colony of Halden's Reach burned. It was not a military target. That was the point. Halden's Reach was a farming settlement of 11,000 people. Founded on a temperate world at the edge of a system, the Ascendancy had quietly decided it wanted for its 2 gas giants and their helium-3 reserves. Humanity, barely a decade into contact with the wider galaxy, had filed a territorial claim through the nascent interstellar concord, a claim Vren's superiors considered a formality to be erased rather than a border to be respected. Erasing it was supposed to send a message. Humans were new, humans were soft, and humans who overreached into contested space would learn the old lesson every young species eventually learned. Submit or be removed. Vren watched the fires spread across the agricultural belts and felt nothing resembling doubt. He had done this before on 3 other worlds against 3 other species who no longer had opinions about territorial claims. It always went the same way. There would be outrage. There would be diplomatic protests lodged by people too far away and too disorganized to do anything about it. And then, in a year or 2, there would be a new treaty quietly favorable to the Ascendancy, and everyone would move on. He did not know, could not have known, that 4 minutes into the bombardment, a woman named Ellen Reyes had crawled into the shielded signal room beneath the Halden's Reach administrative complex, bleeding from a piece of shrapnel in her shoulder, and sent a message that had been prepared and rehearsed by exactly 9 people on the planet, none of whom had ever expected to use it. The message was 6 words long. It did not go to any human fleet, because humanity did not have a fleet capable of doing anything about the Sindrith Ascendancy. It did not go to the Concord because the Concord could only talk. It went into the dark, to a designation that did not appear on any registry, military or civilian, in known space. The message read, "Halden's Reach is being erased." Then it went silent because the signal room, like everything else on the surface, stopped existing 40 seconds later. Vren Talis finished his bombardment, logged the operation as a territorial correction, and set a course out of the system, entirely satisfied that Halden's Reach had ceased to be a problem. He was wrong. He had just become one. 6 hours earlier, Halden's Reach had looked like nothing worth destroying. Ellen Reyes had spent the morning doing the kind of work that never made it into any colony's official history. Recalibrating a weather relay that kept losing sync with the irrigation network, arguing good-naturedly with a farm cooperative supervisor about grain storage allocations, and eating a late breakfast on the steps of the signal annex with 2 coworkers who complained, as they did most mornings, about the slowness of Concord approval for the colony's next expansion permit. Halden's Reach was not a wealthy settlement. It grew grain and raised livestock on a world with unusually fertile soil and unusually thin legal protection, a combination the colony's founders had understood as a risk from the beginning and had, in a decision most of the 11,000 residents didn't know existed, quietly hedged against. Ellen was one of 9 people on the planet who had been briefed, in a 15-minute meeting 4 years earlier, that she had been told never to repeat and had, in fact, never repeated, on the existence of an emergency channel that reported to no government office, no Concord authority, and no colony administrator. She had been given a 6-word phrase to send if the day ever came that the colony's survival depended on someone, somewhere, knowing exactly what had happened to it. She had assumed, in the ordinary way people assume things about disasters that have never happened to them, that she would never use it. The first strikes hit the agricultural belt at 0847 local time, without warning, without demand, without the customary opening transmission most aggressor fleets sent before an attack. a detail that told her, in the chaotic half-second before the second wave of impacts reached the administrative district, that this was not a negotiation. It was an erasure, and it had already begun. She ran for the signal annex through streets that no longer resembled the streets she had walked that morning, past a farm cooperative supervisor whose complaints about grain storage would never be resolved, and reached the shielded relay 2 floors beneath the administrative complex with a piece of debris buried in her shoulder and the absolute, cold certainty that she would not survive the hour. She sent the 6 words anyway, because the entire point of the channel had never been her own survival. It had been the 11,000 people above her, and the possibility, unproven and unlikely as it had always seemed in the abstract, that somewhere in the dark someone was listening. 9 days passed before anyone noticed the pattern, and by then it was already too late to matter. The first ship was the Ossuary Wind, a Sindrith logistics cruiser en route to resupply a border garrison 3 systems away from what remained of Halden's reach. It failed to make its scheduled check-in. This was not, on its own, remarkable. Communication relays in the perimeter dark were unreliable, and logistics cruisers missed check-ins constantly, usually because of nothing more sinister than equipment failure or an overworked comms officer. A search vessel found the Ossuary Wind adrift 4 days later, its reactor cold, its hull intact, and every member of its crew of 40 still strapped into their stations, alive, unharmed, and with no memory of anything happening at all. One moment they had been running their standard patrol course. The next they were drifting, powerless, with 6 hours unaccounted for. The Ascendancy's investigators called it a rare and unfortunate systems failure. They rebuilt the reactor, reassigned the crew, and filed the incident under an inconsequential case number. The second ship, the picket cruiser Haven's Grasp, was not so fortunate. It vanished entirely 11 days after Halden's reach, along with all 110 souls aboard. No wreckage, no distress call, no debris field. It had been screening the outer edge of a mining operation the Ascendancy had recently expanded into territory that, coincidentally, bordered what human survey charts still marked, out of habit rather than any legal standing, as the Halden system. The Ascendancy's investigators called this one an unfortunate encounter with an undetected gravitational anomaly. There were, after all, no other ships in a 100 light-year radius capable of destroying a warship of that class without leaving a trace. Certainly not human ships. The Ascendancy's own intelligence assessments, reviewed and confirmed twice, rated humanity's naval capacity as negligible, regional patrol vessels only, no blue water force projection, no evidence of capital-class construction. They were, in the most literal sense, correct. Humanity did not have a fleet capable of hunting Sindrith warships across the perimeter dark. Humanity had one ship. Fleet Marshal Doran Vask received the 6-word message from Halden's Reach 41 seconds after it was sent, relayed through 3 unregistered signal buoys scattered along a stretch of empty space that human charts labeled, with deliberate blandness, as the cutter's belt debris field. There was no debris field. There had never been a debris field. It was a name chosen specifically because no one who saw it on a chart would ever think to look twice. Vask was 61 years old and had spent the last 14 of those years commanding a ship that officially did not exist, crewed by 206 people who officially did not exist either. When the Concord had been formed and humanity had, for the first time, been forced to reckon with a galaxy full of species that solved territorial disputes with orbital bombardment, a very small number of people in a very small number of governments had come to a very uncomfortable conclusion. Diplomacy would buy time, but it would not buy safety. Something else would be needed. Something that could not be found in any registry, claimed by any government or traced back to any single human authority, because the moment it could be, it would become a target, a bargaining chip, or an excuse. So they built the Kraken. It was not named for its size, though it was large. 800 meters of hull built from alloys and shielding humanity had reverse-engineered, refined, and in several critical respects improved upon, from salvaged wreckage of a Concord peacekeeping vessel that had crashed on Earth's own territory 11 years earlier, an accident the Concord had quietly written off as a total loss and never bothered to reclaim. It was named for what it was supposed to do: stay hidden in the deep, unseen and unconsidered, until something worth surfacing for came within reach. Vask read the message twice. Then he stood from his chair on the bridge, a bridge with no insignia, no flag, no markings that would identify it as belonging to any nation on Earth, and said the only words the moment required. Set a course for Halden's Reach. We're too late to save them. We are not too late for what comes next. His tactical officer, a woman named Priya Okonjo-Ilich, who had been recruited out of a naval intelligence program that no longer existed on paper, looked up from her station. Full engagement protocol, sir? No, Vask said. Something quieter than that. What followed was not a war. Wars had fronts and declarations and two sides who knew they were fighting. What followed was closer to a dismantling. The Kraken did not travel to Halden's Reach to reclaim it, because there was nothing left to reclaim. It traveled there to read the wreckage, every fragment of Sindrith hull plating, every burn pattern left by orbital strike craft, every log buoy the retreating fleet hadn't bothered to scrub, and from that wreckage to build a picture of exactly who had done this, which ships had done it, which fleet command structure they answered to, and which supply and patrol routes those ships would use to get home. Took 6 days. The Kraken's crew were not soldiers in the conventional sense. A third of them were intelligence analysts. Another third were engineers who had spent a career designing systems meant to make an 800-meter warship look, to any sensor suite the Ascendancy possessed, like empty space with unusually cold thermal noise. The rest were combat specialists, chosen as much for patience as for skill, because the Kraken's doctrine had never been built around winning fights quickly. It had been built around not needing to fight at all until the moment was exactly right. The Asura wind was the test. Vask wanted to know, before committing to anything larger, whether 14 years of theory actually worked against a live Sindrith crew. The Kraken matched velocity with the logistics cruiser from 11,000 kilometers out, close enough for a full sensor read, far enough that the Asura wind's outdated detection suite. Vask's analysts had catalogued every generation of Sindrith shipboard sensor package from 6 years of quiet observation, registered nothing but background noise. A directed neural disruption pulse, an experimental system the engineering staff had nicknamed, without much affection, the lullaby, swept the cruiser's crew into unconsciousness for 6 hours. In that window, a boarding team crossed the gap, downloaded every scrap of the ship's navigational data, tactical logs, and fleet communication records, and left without touching a single weapon system, a single life support module, or a single crew member's body. They wanted information. They got it. Every route, every rendezvous point, every garrison schedule the Asura wind had ever been trusted with was now sitting in the Kraken's data core, and the Sindrith Ascendancy had no idea it was gone. The boarding itself was, by design, almost anticlimactic. Master Sergeant Toma Adeyemi led the team of 6 across 11,000 kilometers of open space in a stealth transfer pod that registered on no sensor suite the Sindrith had ever fielded, and cut into the Asura wind's secondary maintenance airlock using a plasma cutter tuned to leave an edge indistinguishable, to any inspection short of a full forensic teardown, from ordinary metal fatigue. Inside, the corridors were lit in the low amber the Sindrith preferred for off-duty cycles, and the crew lay where the lullaby pulse had put them, slumped at stations, folded over consoles, breathing slow and even, utterly unaware that 6 armed strangers were walking past them. Adeyemi had done this 11 times by the campaign's end, and it never stopped feeling strange. Not frightening, the Kraken's doctrine had stripped fear out of the equation almost entirely, since an unconscious crew posed no threat a boarding team couldn't manage. What lingered instead was a kind of quiet, uncomfortable intimacy. Stepping over a Sindrith officer's motionless body to reach a data terminal, close enough to see the alien's breathing fog a nearby display, close enough to notice the small, unmilitary details. A child's drawing taped inside a locker, a half-finished meal left cooling at a console. That made the war, if it could even be called that, feel less like a campaign against an empire and more like a slow, surgical argument with several thousand individual people who had simply been unlucky enough to serve under officers who signed the wrong orders. He never mentioned this to Vask directly. It wasn't relevant to the mission, and the Kraken's culture, cultivated deliberately over 14 years, discouraged the kind of righteous certainty that made atrocities easy to justify. They downloaded the data, left every system exactly as they'd found it, and were back aboard the transfer pod within 40 minutes. The Asura wind's crew none the wiser that anything had happened at all beyond 6 lost hours they would spend the rest of their careers unable to explain. The Haven's grasp got no such courtesy. By the time the Kraken found it, Vask's people had already identified it as one of the 4 ships that had participated directly in the Halden's Reach bombardment. Its hull's particular ion drive signature matched a burn pattern recorded from orbit during the attack, cross-referenced against the salvaged logs. There was no ambiguity left to resolve, and no reason for restraint. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. The Kraken's primary weapon system, a rail-driven kinetic penetrator array built to punch through capital ship armor at velocities the Ascendancy's shield technology had never been designed to stop, fired 11 rounds. The Haven's Grasp fired 0, because its sensors never registered a threat before the first round crossed the 1,100-kilometer engagement gap. There were no survivors, and Vask did not pretend, even privately, to regret it. He regretted, instead, that this would only be the beginning. By the 40th day, the Ascendancy's regional command had stopped calling the losses coincidence and started calling them a pattern, though they still had no name for what was causing it and no data suggesting the cause was human. That gap in understanding was not an accident. It was the entire point of the Kraken's design. Every engagement was built to look like something else. A ship lost near a stellar flare event was recorded, in the wreckage that remained, as a radiation-related systems cascade. A ship lost in a dense asteroid field was left with enough impact damage on its hull, deliberately inflicted by the boarding teams before departure, to support a theory of navigational error. Vask's people were not merely hiding the Kraken's presence. They were manufacturing plausible absences, false stories the Ascendancy's own investigators would construct for them, because a mystery with no explanation drew scrutiny, and a mystery with a bad but plausible explanation did not. High Overseer Vrentalis, whose fleet had led the Halden's Reach operation and who had since been reassigned to oversee the broader border consolidation effort, began to feel the losses personally around the 6th week, when the Ashrit, a heavy escort cruiser under his direct command, failed to arrive at a scheduled fleet rendezvous. He convened an inquiry. The inquiry found nothing because there was nothing to find. The Kraken had by then refined its methods to the point of near invisibility, and Vask had made a deliberate decision that the Ashrit, unlike the Haven's Grasp, would vanish entirely rather than leave a body of evidence behind. No wreckage, no survivors, no story for the Ascendancy to tell itself. Vren did not know, and would not know for another 2 months, that the reason was simple. The Ashrit had not participated in the bombardment of Halden's Reach. It had, however, been one of 6 ships that had turned away an evacuation convoy of unarmed civilian transports attempting to flee the system in the attack's opening hour, firing warning shots across their bows and forcing them back down into the bombardment rather than letting them run. Vask's analysts had pulled that detail from the salvaged colony logs, cross-referenced against Ascendancy fleet movement records recovered from the Osura Winds data core, and it had gone onto a list. The list, by the 40th day, had 19 names on it. By the 90th day, it had 6. Vrentalis's name was not the 6th. It was the 1st. The Ascendancy's Border Fleet Command finally convened a formal task force in the 4th month, not because they had identified a cause, but because the accumulated losses, 14 ships, over 2,000 personnel, an entire logistics chain quietly unraveling along the border they had spent the last several years expanding, had become impossible to explain away as coincidence, sabotage by rival Ascendancy factions, or, as one particularly desperate theory suggested, an unusually aggressive native predator species. They did not suspect humans. This was not stupidity. It was, from their perspective, simple arithmetic. Every intelligence assessment the Ascendancy possessed rated human military capability as minimal, their technology derivative and unrefined, their unified command structure practically non-existent. Humanity was, after all, still governed by dozens of separate nations who could barely agree with one another, let alone project the kind of sustained, coordinated, technologically superior campaign that had been quietly gutting a border fleet for 4 months. It did not occur to the task force that the very disunity they mocked was, in this one specific and carefully guarded instance, a deliberate cover. A single, unregistered, unaccountable ship, built and crewed in total secrecy specifically so that no nation could be blamed, no government could be held responsible, and no diplomatic consequence could ever be traced back to a flag. The task force instead settled on a working theory. An unknown third-party actor, likely a rival polity probing Ascendancy border weakness for its own territorial gain, was responsible. They redirected 4 additional cruisers to reinforce the border. It was, in Vask's private assessment when the Kraken's intelligence team intercepted the deployment orders, exactly the kind of decision that made his job easier. For more targets, moving on predictable routes with no idea what they were actually walking into. He did not deploy the Kraken against them immediately. Patience, more than firepower, had always been the ship's real weapon. Instead, he waited 11 days, tracking their patrol pattern, until the 4 cruisers settled into a rotation that put each of them, at some point in every cycle, alone. Priya Okonjo-Iweala had joined the program 19 years earlier, recruited out of an intelligence unit whose funding had been quietly rerouted so completely that even the people who'd once run it no longer remembered its budget line existed. She had spent most of her career believing, with the particular grim certainty of someone who had read too many threat assessments, that the Kraken would never actually be used, that it existed as an insurance policy, a thing built precisely so it would never have to fire a shot, its mere unconfirmed possibility enough to give any government considering aggression against Earth a reason for pause. She had been wrong, and on the bridge during the 5th month of the campaign, watching the tactical display track the last of the 4 reinforcement cruisers as it separated from its formation on a routine sensor sweep, she found herself thinking about Halden's reach more than she expected to. Not the bombardment itself. She had never set foot there, had no family there, no personal stake beyond the 6-word message that had started all of it. What she thought about instead was the fact that 11,000 people who had done nothing except settle a planet in a system the Concorde's own charts recognized as legally theirs had been erased by an empire that assumed no consequence would ever follow, because consequence required a fleet, and everyone knew humanity didn't have one. "Target is isolated," she reported. "Full sensor blind spot, per pattern." Vask nodded from the command chair, his expression unreadable in the way it had been for most of the last 5 months. "Boarding protocol. I want their command logs, their fleet cipher keys, and I want it done without a single shot fired, if it can be managed." Could not always be managed. Twice in the campaign's first 3 months, a Sindrith crew had woken early from the lullaby pulse, forcing a boarding team to fall back on lethal contingency rather than risk exposure, and both times Vask had reviewed the engagement personally afterward, unwilling to let even a justified use of force become routine simply because it had once been necessary. He wanted his people to remember that every unconscious body they stepped over belonged to someone who would wake up in 6 hours with no idea how close they had come to not waking up at all, and he wanted that awareness to cost them something every time, rather than nothing. This time it could be managed. The cruiser's crew woke 6 hours later, adrift, powerless, with no memory of anything unusual, exactly as the Osura Wind's crew had. What they did not know, and what the Ascendancy's investigators would never determine, was that in those 6 hours the Kraken's boarding team had extracted the Ascendancy's entire regional fleet cipher, the encryption key underlying every classified communication their border command had sent for the last 3 years. It was, in the language Vask used privately to describe the moment to his senior staff, the key to the vault. Everything after this point would not be hunting. It would be reading the enemy's mail. The 6th month was the quiet one, and it was the most dangerous because quiet on a ship like the Kraken never meant rest. It meant the analysts were working. With the fleet cipher in hand, Vask's intelligence team spent 3 weeks doing nothing but listening, reconstructing months of Ascendancy border communications, mapping command structures, cross-referencing every officer's name against the growing archive of evidence pulled from Halden's reach and the ships taken since. What emerged was not a single villain to be punished. It was a chain of command, dozens of names deep, each one having signed off on some piece of the operation that had ended 11,000 human lives. The strike authorization, the fleet deployment orders, the post-operation report that had described the bombardment, with bureaucratic indifference as a territorial correction, complete, no further action required. Vask had built the Kraken's doctrine around a principle he had never once had to articulate aloud in 14 years, because until now, it had never been tested: proportional, deliberate, and untraceable response, aimed not at provoking a war humanity could not win, but at making the cost of the next attack on a human world so quietly, thoroughly unbearable that no rational actor in the Ascendancy's command structure would ever authorize one again. That meant restraint mattered as much as force. It would have been easy, with the fleet cipher and the accumulated intelligence, to strike at Ascendancy civilian infrastructure, to make the campaign loud, to make it a story other species across the galaxy would tell. Vask forbade it explicitly, in the same clip tone he used for every order. The Kraken did not exist to prove a point to the galaxy. It existed to make one very specific, very narrow point to one very specific chain of command. This will not happen again, and you will never be entirely certain why or by whom or when the next cost will come due. Fear without an enemy to name was, in Vask's judgment, the only kind of fear that actually lasted. For people on Earth had the authority to end the campaign with a single order, and in the 7th month all 4 convened by secure link to decide whether they should. They were not generals. The program had been built specifically so that no single military chain of command could claim ownership of it, and the 4 who oversaw it, a retired diplomat, a former colonial administrator who had lost a sister in an early, smaller act of alien aggression nobody outside a classified file had ever heard of, a systems theorist who had helped design the Kraken's original doctrine, and a sitting official whose title, on paper, had nothing to do with defense. Met rarely and never in the same location twice. The systems theorist, a soft-spoken woman named Adiz Nwosu, was the one who raised the question none of the others wanted to say aloud first. "We are 8 months into an operation that has killed several thousand Sindrith personnel," she said. "At what point does proportional response become something we can no longer defend, even to ourselves?" The former colonial administrator, whose name appeared in no public record and whose sister's death had never been formally acknowledged by any government, answered before anyone else could. "At the point where we start enjoying it. We are not there. I've read every after-action report. Vask has turned down 11 opportunities for a larger kill count in favor of extraction and restraint. That is not vengeance. That is the only sustainable version of deterrence anyone has ever managed to design. It's still a 14-year secret," the retired diplomat said quietly, "kept from every government we claim to answer to, executed against a civilization that outnumbers us by a factor of thousands, using a warship no elected body ever approved. If this becomes public, to our own people, not just the Ascendancy, what does it do to every institution we've built since first contact?" Nobody had a clean answer to that, and Nwosu did not pretend to offer one. "It does whatever it does," she said finally. The alternative was letting Halden's reach be the first of many, and trusting that a concord with no enforcement mechanism and a dozen competing member governments would somehow discourage the next attack through strongly worded correspondence. "We built the Kraken because we already knew what that alternative looked like. We don't get to be surprised by the cost of the thing we built specifically to avoid a worse one." The vote, when it came, was unanimous, though none of the 4 described it afterward as an easy decision. The campaign would continue under the same restraint until Vask's own judgment determined the message had been received. No one on Earth outside that room, and no one aboard the Kraken beyond its own crew, would ever know the decision had been made at all. By the 7th month, High Overseer Vrentalis was no longer sleeping well, though he would not have admitted this to anyone, least of all himself. He had been transferred twice, each time to a post nominally more senior and functionally further from the border, in a pattern his superiors would have called career advancement and Vren privately understood as quarantine. Whatever was killing Ascendancy ships along the frontier had not touched him directly, but it had touched everyone around him. Subordinates reassigned to the losses, colleagues who no longer answered correspondence, an entire cruiser squadron he had personally trained now listed, without exception, as lost with all hands or recovered with no memory of what had happened to them. He had also begun, in the quiet moments his new administrative post afforded him, to reread his own after-action report from Halden's Reach, the one he had filed with bureaucratic satisfaction 8 months earlier. He found himself lingering, for reasons he could not entirely name, on the line about the unregistered signal, routed to the perimeter dark, that he had dismissed with a flick of 2 fingers and a single word, junk space. He requested the original sensor logs from that day. It took 3 weeks of internal channels, each slower and more suspicious than the last, before a junior signals archivist finally produced them. Vren spent a night alone in his quarters running the 6-word messages transmission path through every commercial and military relay database the Ascendancy possessed, and found nothing. No registered buoy. No flagged carrier signal. No record in any database he had clearance to access of where that message had actually gone. Which meant, he understood slowly and with a cold, specific dread that had nothing to do with rank or protocol, that whatever received it existed entirely outside anything the Ascendancy had ever accounted for. He tried once to raise it with a colleague, a fellow overseer named Bassick, or one of the few officers from the original Halden's Reach operation still speaking to him, over a private meal in a station canteen far from any recording array either of them trusted. He did not explain the signal directly. He asked instead carefully whether Bassick had ever wondered what exactly humanity's border defenses actually consisted of, given how thoroughly Ascendancy intelligence had dismissed them before the operation began. Bassick had laughed, at first, the easy laugh of someone who had not yet lost anyone close to the pattern of disappearances working its way through the border fleet. Then he had stopped laughing because Vren's expression had not changed, and something in the set of it made the question feel less like idle speculation and more like a confession neither of them was equipped to have in a public canteen. "You think it's them," Bassick said finally, quietly. "You think a species we rated as negligible has been doing this to us for 6 months." "I think," Vren said, "that I have read the sensor logs from the day we destroyed their colony, and I cannot explain where the distress signal went, and I have watched 19 names disappear from the fleet roster since, in an order that makes a specific kind of sense if you assume someone is working through a list." Bassick did not report the conversation. Whether from loyalty, disbelief, or the same instinct for self-preservation that had kept Vren silent this long, neither man ever spoke of it again. Bassick. Orcs' name would appear, for weeks later, among the officers quietly reassigned to postings that did not exist. Vren never learned whether it was coincidence, and understood, with a clarity he found he could no longer unknow, that he would probably never be permitted to. He did not report his realization to his superiors. He was not entirely sure why, though later, much later, he would understand it had been a kind of self-preservation his instincts had reached for before his conscious mind caught up. Some part of him had already guessed that whatever was hunting the border fleet was not a rival empire probing for weakness. It was something Halden's Reach itself had called, deliberately, in its final minutes, and Vren Tallis had been the officer standing over the trigger when it happened. The final phase of the campaign did not look, from the outside, like an ending. It looked like an ordinary supply convoy escort mission, 3 cruisers and a transport, moving along a route the Ascendancy considered secure precisely because it lay well inside what remained of their reinforced border. The same border that, unknown to anyone still serving on it, had been effectively hollowed out from within for the better part of a year. Vren Tallis was not aboard any of the 3 cruisers. He had, by then, been reassigned a 3rd time to a staff position on a mid-sized command vessel 2 systems removed from the border entirely, a post so thoroughly divorced from combat operations that he had begun, against his better judgment, to let himself believe he was safe. He was not the target. He had never really been the point. The Kraken took the convoy without firing a single shot, using the same neural disruption protocol that had worked 11 times before, and extracted, in the 6 hours the escort crew spent unconscious, the last piece of intelligence Vask's team needed. The full personnel roster and current posting locations of every officer who had signed off on the Halden's Reach operation, cross-referenced against 3 years of fleet cipher traffic that made their individual roles in the decision. Undeniable. 19 names had gone onto that list 8 months earlier. 13 had already been quietly, deniably removed from active service. Not killed, in most cases, though 4 had been, in engagements where Vask judged direct combat culpability left no other proportionate response. The remainder had simply had their careers unravel with a precision that felt, to those living through it, uncannily specific. Transfers to postings that didn't exist, promotions rescinded on paperwork technicalities that had never been technicalities before, entire units reassigned out from under officers who arrived to command them and found nothing there. Vren Tallis received his own summons on the 231st day since Halden's Reach, in the form of a message routed through his command vessel's internal system, appearing on his personal terminal with no sender identification the ship's security logs could ever trace. Contained no threat. It contained 6 words, the same length as the message that had started everything, though he would not learn that detail until much later, from an intelligence summary the Ascendancy's border command finally compiled and then, for reasons of institutional embarrassment, buried. Halden's Reach remembers. So do we. Nothing happened to him that night or the next or the one after that. He was not killed. His ship was not attacked. His career, against every expectation he had built over the preceding 8 months of watching his colleagues disappear one by one, continued largely undisturbed. He understood, eventually, that this was the point. He had been left alive, deliberately, specifically, as the one witness who would carry the knowledge forward. That somewhere in the dark beyond the border, something human, something the Ascendancy had never accounted for and could still not name, had watched Halden's Reach burn, had listened to a 6-word signal nobody thought would matter, and had spent the better part of a year proving, with total and merciless precision, exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Fleet Marshal Doran Vask stood on the Kraken's bridge on the day the campaign formally ended, though ended was a word he used carefully, in a report that would be read by exactly 4 people on Earth and then sealed for 100 years. The ship was not returning to any port that existed on a public register. It was returning to the deep, to the same silence it had come from, to wait, because that, in the end, was the entire architecture of what he had spent 14 years building. Not a fleet meant to fight wars. A single, patient, unseen thing meant to make the next aggressor hesitate, if only for a moment, wondering whether the quiet at the edge of human space was truly empty, or whether something was simply choosing, for now, not to surface. Priya Okonjo-Iweala found him there after the final report was filed, watching a star field that held no record, anywhere, of the ship's own name. "Do you think it worked?" she asked. "Talus, the others. Do you think they'll actually hesitate next time, or just get better at hiding what they're doing?" Vask considered the question with the same unhurried patience he had given every decision over the past year. "Both, probably. That's not failure. That's the cost of an enemy learning caution instead of contempt. It's slower than winning. It's the only version of winning we can actually afford." He thought, though he did not say it aloud, of Ellen Reyes, the signals officer at Halden's Reach who had sent 6 words into the dark with a piece of shrapnel in her shoulder, trusting a system she had never seen used, built by people she would never meet, for a purpose she could only hope was real. She had not survived the attack. Her name was recorded, along with every other resident of Halden's Reach, on a memorial plaque built in a quiet government building on Earth that almost no one was permitted to visit, under a program with no public name. The Kraken would carry that name into the dark with it, unspoken, on every mission that came after. Not as vengeance completed, because Vask did not believe vengeance was ever truly completed. As a promise kept, once, when it mattered, to 11,000 people who never knew help was coming, and to whatever world might someday need the same promise kept again. The ship dimmed its running lights, one system at a time, until even its own crew could no longer see the hull around them. Then it turned, silent and unregistered, back into the deep it had never really left, and waited. Somewhere behind it, across a border it had spent a year quietly redrawing without a single treaty ever being signed. An empire that had once assumed humanity had no teeth was learning, one vanished ship at a time, exactly how wrong an assumption could be. It would be 3 more years before the Sindrath Ascendancy attempted another unprovoked strike against a human colony. It would not attempt a third. On Earth, in a government building most of its own staff had never been cleared to enter, a man named Rafael Reyes stood in front of a plaque bearing 11,000 names, arranged not by rank or accomplishment but simply by the alphabet, the way a farming colony had always organized its own community directories. He came once a year, on a date the program's caretakers had quietly set aside for the handful of surviving relatives who had, over time, been read into just enough of the truth to understand that his sister's death had not been meaningless, without ever being told what exactly had been done in its wake. No one had explained the Kraken to him. No one ever would. He knew only that Ellen had believed, in her final minutes, that sending 6 words into an unmarked channel mattered, and that a stranger in a gray suit had come to his door 8 months after the attack to tell him, in careful, deliberately vague language, that her signal had been received, and that it had not gone unanswered. He did not know what unanswered had cost on either side of the exchange, and the caretakers of the program had decided, in an ethics review conducted long before he was ever told anything, that he never should. What he knew was smaller and, in its own way, more durable than any tactical briefing could have offered him. That his sister had not died believing help was impossible. She had died trusting it existed, in the dark, at the edge of everything humanity had built, waiting. He touched her name once, the way he did every year, and left before anyone could see that he was not entirely composed. Above him, unmarked and unremembered by anyone outside a handful of people who would never speak of it publicly, a single ship moved through the deep, running dark, waiting for a signal it hoped it would never have to answer again.